Hello, my name is Shelby and this is Merrily Morbid. Today we will be talking about an insidious agent that exists all around us, fungus. Many of us will develop an infection of this nature at some point in our lives, whether it's athlete's foot, a yeast infection, or ringworm. But for a few, their infections can't be cured with over-the-counter medications, and their infections will change their lives. Today we will talk about 7 types of fungal infections that can bring you to the brink of death. We all live with fungal spores around us. We all breathe in these spores not knowing it. And for most of us, it's like nothing happened. Our immune systems jump into action and destroy the spores long before it can take hold in the body. But sometimes, for reasons unknown, healthy individuals can contract a fungal illness, although it usually happens to people who are immunocompromised. Quite often, those who develop these infections are people who have had organ transplants and are on steroids which lower the immune system. Some people are those who have undergone cancer treatments, which leads to low immune response. And for some, they are people with conditions like asthma or cystic fibrosis, where the lungs have a harder time removing air. The fungus can be breathed in and become trapped in the lungs where it takes hold and infection develops. Most of the fungal infections are treated the same way, with the same types of medications depending on the severity. Medications like itraconazole and amphotericin B are common when treating these infections. Most molds are found in the environment growing in soil, in the decaying wood of dead trees, or in bird or bat droppings, but sometimes they can grow in the place we feel the safest, our home. Aspergillus is a very common mold that can be found indoors and outdoors. People breathe it in every day, but most will never become sick from it. There are around 180 different species of Aspergillus, but only about 40 are known to be harmful to humans. It may be difficult to pinpoint a source of Aspergillus spores, as the incubation time for infection isn't known, and probably depends on the amount of exposure and the person's immune function. Often, if a person shows symptoms of exposure to Aspergillus, it is usually an allergic form called allergic bronchopulmonary aspergillosis. It is literally an allergic reaction to the spores itself. Symptoms of this could include wheezing, shortness of breath, cough, and sometimes fever. People can also develop invasive aspergillosis, which is when the body is invaded by the Aspergillus fungus. People with invasive aspergillosis may experience fever, chest pain, cough, coughing up blood, or shortness of breath. In some people with an Aspergillus infection, they can develop masses called aspergillomas. They are balls made up of fungus fibers, mucus, tissue debris, and inflammatory cells, and blood clotting proteins. In extreme cases, these masses can cause coughing up blood that leads to suffocation. It is possible for one to go away without treatment, but it is also possible for them to remain even with aggressive treatment. When this happens, it is called chronic cavitary pulmonary aspergillosis, and it is a lifelong condition. Most instances of aspergillosis are standalone cases, although it is possible for outbreaks to happen. Surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, outbreaks usually happen in hospitals among hospitalized patients, and it is usually due to hospital renovation or construction. It should also be mentioned that invasive aspergillosis is especially dangerous in transplant patients. The mortality rate among these patients can range from 25% for stem cell recipients to a startling 59% of organ transplant recipients. The anti-rejection medication that prevents the body from destroying the new stem cells or organs, unfortunately prevents the body from being able to destroy any infections. There was a study of ICU autopsies that concluded that aspergillosis was one of the top 4 most common diagnoses that kill ICU patients. However, one couple who had been previously healthy would learn that aspergillus can really affect anyone. Lizzie and Anthony Branch were newlyweds when they bought a new-built home in North Carolina. Lizzie was the first to begin having symptoms. One morning at work, she noticed she was feeling groggy when suddenly she experienced a sharp pain on one side of her head. Not having anything with her that she could take for the pain, she decided to go home and take the rest of the day off. By the time her husband got home from work, the headache had become more of a migraine with extreme sensitivity to light. They didn't think much of it and decided just to wait it out. By the next morning, Lizzie felt better, and for a few weeks, life continued as normal. One day at work, as a counselor, she was disturbed when she realized she was having a hard time recalling details about her clients. A few weeks later, yet another symptom would appear. This time she began experiencing sinus pressure that she couldn't relieve. She goes to the doctor, believing that it's just a run-of-the-mill sinus infection, and she's given antibiotics. The infection would clear up and life would go on. Come fall, she would yet again have a new symptom. One morning, she would wake up to a burning rash covering her hands. Again, she goes to the doctor and is given a steroid cream for the rash and sent home. They have no idea that Lizzie's afflictions are all connected. Strangely enough, the next symptom to appear wouldn't be Lizzie's, but Anthony's. One night, while watching TV, Anthony would have a profusely bloody nose that he couldn't get to stop. He would begin having these nosebleeds regularly over the course of the next couple weeks. He would begin experiencing shortness of breath, and now he would pay his first visit to the doctor, where he would be diagnosed with adult-onset asthma and given an inhaler. Later that fall, Anthony would begin experiencing memory problems himself. At this point, they put together that whatever was affecting Lizzie was also affecting Anthony. After a visual contrast acuity test, which they both failed, a toxicologist informed them that they were suffering from the effects of exposure to the mold Aspergillosis. They both had systemic infections, which could be deadly. Aside from being put on strong antifungal medications, it is suggested that they have their new home evaluated for mold. It was found that mold was in the air, on the walls, and even on their furniture throughout the home. Not only devastating to their health, but was also devastating to their house. They were able to save a few possessions, but almost everything was contaminated and had to be trashed. The house was uninhabitable in that condition, and they had to sell it. What had been their dream home, the one they envisioned someday raising children in, now had to be sold for a huge financial loss. Even now, they still experience the lasting effects of their exposure to Aspergillosis. They have since achieved their dream of becoming parents and now have 2 children, and they live in a home that they rigorously work to keep mold-free. The next fungal infection I would like to talk about is Cryptococcosis, which is caused by one of the 2 fungi, Cryptococcus neoformans or Cryptococcus gattii. C. neoformans really only affects immunocompromised people, such as cancer patients or HIV/AIDS patients. C. gattii, like Aspergillus, can sicken the healthiest people. Cryptococcosis's symptoms don't rely much on which fungus you have contracted, but what part of the body has been invaded. Cryptococcal pneumonia can cause a person to have cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, or fever. A person who has cryptococcal meningitis, where it has invaded the brain, can experience fever, headache, neck pain or stiffness, nausea, vomiting, and sensitivity to light. If the skin is infected, you could see thick patches of skin, rashes, sores, or blisters. Like Aspergillus, it is also possible for masses to form. When caused by Cryptococcus, they are called cryptococcomas. Depending on the location and the severity of the infections, antifungal treatment may last weeks or months. The mortality of C. neoformans infection is about 12%. But in its cryptococcal meningitis form, it's 100% if not treated. The mortality rate of C. gattii ranges from 13 to 33%. Incubation for cryptococcosis is between 2 and 13 months after breathing in the fungus, with 6 to 7 months being most common. It is possible for it to happen as quickly as 2 weeks or as slowly as 3 years. The next 2 people couldn't be more different, but each would face the same deadly enemy, Cryptococcus. Frank Tarantino was a beloved grandfather living in Amityville, New York. He was a cancer survivor, and he had just survived a second battle with cancer the year before when he became sick in the fall of 2011. His wife noticed that he was having a lot of coughing while he was lying down relaxing one day. They observed that cough medicine had no effect on his coughing, and a week after it had began, he woke up and realized that he had new symptoms. He had a dull headache, dizziness, and he was leaning when he tried to walk. His wife was terrified and immediately brought him to the local emergency room. After many tests, they came back with a diagnosis of vertigo. He was given IV fluids and sent home when he reported that he felt better. 5 days after his visit to the ER, they observed an extreme change in personality when Frank physically attacked his son Brian and was threatening to kill him. About a week later, his wife Roseanne was woken up in the middle of the night and found her husband on the ground bleeding. Their other son, Frank, who lived with them, was attempting to help get him off the floor and expressed wanting to take his father back to the hospital. But Frank was becoming belligerent and ended up hitting his son in the face. Now that he had attacked 2 of his children, his family believed it was time to go back to the hospital because something was seriously wrong. This time, doctors decided to send Frank in for an MRI, and this time, they would find something extremely concerning. The MRI results showed that Frank had lesions in his brain and were causing his headaches and his newly violent behavior. What they didn't know was what was causing these lesions, but they gave him a dire prognosis of only 3 months to live. He was given pain medication and was discharged to spend his last days at home with his family. But his family refused to accept this and decided to seek out a second opinion. Frank's new doctor ordered a spinal tap in order to look for a cause for these brain lesions. The spinal tap revealed that his spinal fluid was cloudy, which is indicative of an infection of some kind. The lab results would reveal that the infection was caused by a fungus called Cryptococcosis neoformans. They were extremely worried that the infection had gone too long without treatment. They decided to put him on an extremely aggressive antifungal regimen in hopes that they would see a miracle. It would be 4 months before they saw any signs of improvement. It would be another 2 months before he'd get to go home. Amazingly, the only lasting problem he has from this ordeal is that he has some hearing loss, which is amazing considering how close he had come to dying. The next person that we'll talk about is Courtney Blomeen, who was 16 in 2007 when she first became sick. One day, she had been hanging out with some friends smoking marijuana when she felt the urge to cough. She had a productive cough, and when she looked down at what she had coughed up, she noticed it was sputum, but strangely, it had some little black swirls in it. Not being aware, and also being a teenager, she ignored this strange symptom, not realizing how ominous it was. Later the same day, she began experiencing extreme shoulder pain, which she compared to the pain of a dislocation. Once again, she ignored this new development. The next morning, she woke up to further symptoms, dizziness and slight nausea, and now her shoulder pain had spread to her back. She was crying from the pain, and her father decided that it was time to bring her to the doctor. Because of her symptoms, the doctor wanted a chest X-ray. Once the film was developed, they were able to see something that appeared to be pneumonia. Courtney was given a prescription for antibiotics and sent home with instructions to rest. By the next evening, they realized the antibiotics weren't going to work when Courtney's symptoms were not only continuing to get worse, but were getting worse fast. Now she was having a hard time breathing. Once at the hospital, another X-ray was done, and shockingly, the problem had gotten visibly much worse. Not knowing the cause of infection due to how aggressive it was, Courtney was immediately put into isolation. And because of how close quarters she had had with her parents, they were also put into isolation. The doctors were very concerned that she might have tuberculosis. Within days, they would learn that the TB test was negative, but now they had absolutely no idea what was making her sick. And they would need to figure it out quickly, because Courtney was continuing to get worse by the day. And now they were struggling to keep her oxygen levels up. The doctors gave her parents the grim news that if they couldn't reverse her condition, that she would die within 2 days. Finally, the blood results came back and showed that Courtney had a fungal infection called Cryptococcus gattii. She was the 4th person of the year in her county to contract this rare fungus. Despite how advanced her case was, they began to administer an aggressive regimen of antifungal medications. It was days that she bordered life and death before she actually finally began to pull through. Amazingly, after a week on the medication, she was actually healthy enough to go home. Another type of fungus that has a different presentation depending on the area affected is Mucormycosis, which used to be called Zygomycosis. It mainly affects the sinuses or the lungs of those with health problems or those who take medication that inhibit the body's ability to fight infection. Rhinocerebral mucormycosis affects the sinus and brain and can cause a person to have one-sided facial swelling, headache, nasal or sinus congestion, or black lesions in the nose or on the roof of the mouth. If it infects the lungs, it can cause fever, cough, chest pain, shortness of breath. If it affects the digestive system, it can cause abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting, and bleeding of the GI tract. If the fungus gets into the skin via a wound, there can be blisters or ulcers, excessive redness, swelling, warmth at the site, and the infected area can turn black. The mortality rate is extremely high, and depending on the type, regardless of treatment, ranges from 46 to 96%. Outbreaks are rare and usually happen in healthcare settings due to contaminated wood tongue depressors, hospital linens, negative pressure rooms, water leaks, poor air filtration, non-sterile medical devices, and building construction. Community-acquired outbreaks usually happen when there is trauma during natural disasters such as tornadoes. On May 22, 2011, the deadliest tornado of the century hit the city of Joplin, Missouri, and killed 158. Stephen Weersing nearly became the 159th. Stephen was a high-strung kid who was described as being a handful growing up. One sunny day in May 2011, Stephen's mother, Carissa, was outside doing yard work when she noticed that the weather began to change. Once inside, she turned on the local news to learn that there was a tornado seen in the area. She began calling her teenage sons, trying to get a hold of them, not knowing where they were at the time. When she couldn't get through to them, she called her ex-husband. He informed her that their younger son was with him at home, but their older son, Stephen, had been out with friends. Stephen's father then sent a text to him, saying that there's a tornado headed your way, be careful. Neither of his parents would reach him. They had no idea that their son had been out driving around with friends and that they had crashed. Once the tornado had passed, David immediately headed out to try to find his son. He headed to the local hospital. Despite the chaos in the hospital, he managed to find a surgeon who had just seen a boy who matched his son's description. She led him to the boy, who was indeed his son, Stephen. She explained that at the moment he was stable, but had an enormous 15-inch chest wound. Over the next 3 days, Stephen seemed to be on the path to recovery. Soon, they would begin noticing that Stephen was beginning to have a concerning amount of swelling. His doctors believed it to be an infection, and so he was given antibiotics. Days later, on this antibiotic regimen, they realized that he wasn't getting better. He was getting worse, with further swelling, and his blood pressure became unstable. The doctors in Joplin recognized that they were out of their depth and decided that Stephen's best chance would come from him being airlifted to the Children's Hospital in Kansas City. Immediately after his arrival, an infectious disease specialist was assigned to his case. She observed that his large chest wound had become black and necrotic. He was then sent to the operating room to have as much of the dead tissue removed as possible. But even then, the remaining tissue wasn't healthy. Within 2 days, they were back in the operating room, but this time what they would find would shock everyone. This time when they looked at the wound, they could see black mold with the naked eye. It covered his organs and his ribs. Finally, more than 2 weeks after the tornado, they would finally get some answers as to what was continuing to make Stephen so sick. Lab results would reveal that he had a fungal infection called mucormycosis. Normally, Stephen's body would have been able to fight off the fungal infection, but with the wound he received, it left his body dangerously open to infection. In a last-ditch effort, they decided the only chance he would have would be to remove the infected parts of his organs. So parts of his liver, his lungs, and even part of his heart was removed. After 7 weeks and more than 24 surgeries, they learned that his fungal cultures were finally clear. It would be another week before he regained consciousness. It wouldn't be until 5 months after the tornado that he would finally get to go home. Farther north in the Midwest is our next fungus infection, Blastomycosis, with Wisconsin having the highest number of cases. Like other fungal infections, the infection caused by Blastomyces usually infects the immunocompromised, but can sometimes infect the healthy. Between 3 weeks and 3 months after exposure, a person may begin to experience fever, cough, shortness of breath, night sweats, muscle aches, joint pain, weight loss, chest, rib, or back pain, fatigue, and skin lesions. Those who have more severe cases of blastomycosis face a mortality rate of 8 or 9%. Outbreaks of blastomycosis are rare, but can happen, as you'll see in Tom's story. In June of 2015, Tom Horan was at work when he began to cough uncontrollably and began to have some chest pain. After a few hours of trying to make it to the end of his shift, he couldn't take it anymore and decided to leave and head straight for urgent care. There, Tom was told that he had a suspected case of bacterial pneumonia. He was prescribed antibiotics and then sent him home to recover. Over the next 4 days, he took the medication, but he didn't find any relief. He felt too unwell to go to work, and after being out of work for the entire week, he was let go from his job. Over the course of the next 24 hours, his health really plummeted, and his parents, who he lived with, decided that it was time for him to go to the emergency room. There, he underwent a battery of tests. An X-ray would reveal that he had a significant case of pneumonia in his right lung that was beginning to spread to his left lung. He was admitted and put on a stronger antibiotic. Over the next day, it was becoming obvious that he was still getting sicker and sicker. His family was informed that he would need to be transferred by ambulance to another hospital a mile away that employed an infectious disease specialist. At the new hospital, the specialist suspected that it wasn't a bacterial infection and began asking a series of questions. One question was if he had been around any bodies of water. Tom said that early in the summer, he had spent some time on the Wolf River. Immediately, the specialist suspected that he knew what was really going on, because he had seen patients suffering from the same thing, who had reported being on the same river. A sample of Tom's sputum was sent to the lab for confirmation of this hunch. Sure enough, the culture would reveal that Tom had a fungal infection called Blastomycosis. Tom was one of over 100 people who would be affected by this abnormally large outbreak that would go on to kill 11. Tom was immediately put on a very strong antifungal medication, but after a week, they weren't sure if the medication was actually working. It would be 18 days after his initial hospitalization that he finally began to show improvement. It would be several more days before he was able to go home, and it would be a year before he could finally stop taking the antifungal medication. He feels lucky to have survived, and has since found a job in technology. Just as Wisconsin is ground zero for the Blastomyces fungus, the southwest U.S. is ground zero for the fungus Coccidioides, which causes valley fever. Unlike the other fungal infections previously mentioned, mild cases of valley fever have been known to go away on their own, without treatment, usually within weeks to months. It has an incubation time of 1 to 3 weeks, which is quite unlike the others in its speed. When symptoms appear, they may include fatigue, cough, fever, shortness of breath, headaches, night sweats, muscle aches, joint pain, and a rash. Luckily, even though 5 to 10% of people with valley fever will have the severe form, less than 1% of people will have the fungus spread outside the lungs to other parts of the body, such as skin, bones, joints, or the central nervous system. Our next person learned what it was like to be part of that unlucky 1%. Kylie and Vandy Kuyar live in California and love spending time outdoors with their 2 children. Kylie was enjoying a weekend trip in July to Palm Springs with her kids when she began feeling pain and bloating in her pelvic region. She tried to ignore the pain, but by the next day she was in quite a bit more pain and noticed that the bloating was worse. On the ride home, she began to have a headache, began feeling very cold, and just felt off. When she got home, her husband noticed that she had a very prominent rash on her back and suggested that she go get it checked out. Kylie brushed it off as a heat rash and believed that a good night's rest was all she needed. The next morning, though, she would wake up to discover that the rash was now covering her entire body and now had a burning sensation. She also had more swelling than before that made her look quite pregnant, in her own words, about 5 months pregnant. They took a skin biopsy to test for allergies, but it came back negative. Since her symptoms were so prominent, and for now had no known cause, Kylie was admitted for more testing, with a colonoscopy being first on the docket. They began to perform the procedure, but had to quickly abandon it when they couldn't insert the scope due to the immense amount of swelling in her colon. Weeks after the symptoms began, they would perform an ultrasound on her lower abdomen to see if they could gather any clues to this mysterious illness. They determine that her lower abdomen is full of some kind of fluid and decide to collect a sample via needle. While they are pulling back on the plunger, the syringe begins to fill with a yellow fluid and it is immediately sent for testing. As with many cases, it can take days for results to come in. When the results finally did come in, it was revealed that Kylie had valley fever, or Coccidioidomycosis. It was a fungal infection that had spread to her pelvis, her skin, and also her brain, causing valley fever meningitis, which untreated has a 100% fatality rate. She was put on aggressive antifungal treatments, which caused her to experience a lot of side effects, including increased fatigue and nausea. But after a week, she was well enough to go home. It would be several months for her to regain her strength and feel healthy again. She would be hospitalized a few more times due to valley fever, but is doing well. To keep herself healthy, she will remain on antifungal medication the rest of her life. She continues to live in California and works in college admissions. Our next fungus, Histoplasma, has a particular similarity to valley fever. For most people, they will get better on their own without medication, but for those who don't, it can be devastating. Between 3 and 17 days after exposure, a person will begin to experience fever, cough, fatigue, chills, headache, chest pain, body aches. People can become exposed during demolition or cleanup projects. They can also become infected while exploring caves due to the concentration of fungal spores in bat droppings, as our next person would learn firsthand. Cody Fry was in college in 2011 on the path to become a video game designer with dreams of going to Japan to study when he became sick. One night while hanging out with his sister, Ashley, Cody suddenly got up and went to the bathroom, where he began coughing and then threw up. This coughing and vomiting would continue over the next several weeks, and when his sister brought up concerns, he brushed them off and told her not to worry about it. A few days after that, with her concern growing, Ashley confessed to her mom about Cody's persistent illness. Cody's mom went to him, and he finally admitted that he had been throwing up multiple times a day for weeks. She brought him to the family doctor, who thought it could have been caused by allergies and recommended that he take over-the-counter medications for it. After a week taking allergy medication with no relief, Cody's mom took him back to the doctor and demanded answers. So far, over the course of the illness, Cody had lost over 40 pounds. Whatever was causing the illness was causing a dangerous rate of weight loss. The doctor then suggested a new diagnosis of hyperthyroidism, but testing would quickly rule it out. Now perplexed, the doctor ordered a blood test and CT scan of his chest to hopefully find the clue to solving this puzzling illness. After the tests, he went home to wait for the results, when a few hours later he received a phone call from the hospital with a surprising finding. The CT scan revealed that there was a mass of some kind in Cody's chest. They immediately scheduled a biopsy of the mass. The lab reported that the mass was made up of a very dense scar tissue, and further testing on the mass would reveal that the cause was fungal, a fungal infection called Histoplasmosis. He was then informed that it was life-threatening. The scar tissue in victims of histoplasmosis can wrap around organs and lead to heart or lung failure. Cody's scar tissue was wrapped around his heart and his esophagus, which prevented any surgical forms of treatment. Cody is put on the only form of treatment available to him, which was aggressive antifungal medications, which initially seemed to be working for a few months. By this point, he had lost over 100 pounds. Unfortunately, during a follow-up scan of his lungs, a coughing fit during the procedure dislodged a blood clot. They immediately stopped and rushed him up to the intensive care unit, where he was placed into a chemically induced coma, and he was on a breathing machine. It would be 13 days before he showed enough improvement to be taken out of the coma. And in the years to come, he would be put into comas 4 more times due to uncontrollable bleeding from coughing. Unfortunately, despite being on fungal medication, 4 years after becoming sick, histoplasmosis would take his life in October of 2015. We live in a world where fungi can bring us so much joy, from the yeast in our alcohol to the mushrooms on your pizza, Or fungus can cause us quite the annoyance where we must lug ourselves to the closest drugstore. But I hope you never have to experience the fear and misery caused by the fungi that we discussed today. That wraps it up for today. If you wanted to learn more about today's topic, you can find some recommendations for documentaries below. Also below will be links for the resources that I used. If you want to see more from me, like this video, subscribe, and feel free to comment below your own experience with a fungal infection. Or don't. Also see the community page to vote on next week's topic. Be merry, but stay morbid.